They're not included in the calculations for child support. On a 50-50 schedule, they're going to be responsible for them equally. Of course, we can negotiate something different, but by default, that's how it works.
Hello and welcome everyone joining us today. I have with me attorney Austin Miller, a partner at our firm, who has joined me in other episodes specifically talking about support issues and financial matters involving children. So welcome, Austin, and thank you for joining us today.
Always a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yes, and I get the question a lot from clients. I'm assuming you as well, regarding expenses, sort of above and beyond those basic needs of kids, and we commonly hear these expenses referred to as variable expenses. That seems to be a bit of a wishy-washy phrase that we could all use a bit more clarity on. So tell me about variable expenses. What are they?
Yeah, so variable expenses are expenses above and beyond the basic necessities for a kid. And not just basic necessities, but above the necessities of raising the kids. They're usually discretionary. They're things like extracurricular activities, school costs, music lessons, religious education, what those pretty common in our day and age expenses for kids, but not the necessities like food, clothing, and lodging and those types of things.
Understood. So when you're talking about those basics, the things you're saying are not variable expenses. I think you mentioned food, lodging, clothing, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Those items are covered by child support, and these variable expenses are kind of above and beyond those basics.
Yeah, again, and they're going to be so unique and specialized depending on what your kids' interests are, what they're involved in, what you as a family feel is important for kids to experience. So they're not included in the calculations for child support. They're dealt with separately above and beyond.
And who's responsible for paying them?
So variable expenses only come into play when we have at least a shared placement between the parents. So each parent has at least 25% of the time with the kids. Variables are going to come into play. On a 50-50 schedule, they're going to be responsible for them equally. Let's say one parent has 60% of the time, the other parent has 40% of the time. The default would be the parent with 60% of the time pays 60% of those expenses, and the parent with 40% pays 40%. And that's primarily tied to how child support's factored on those different schedules.
Understood. And then in situations where it's not shared placement, so one parent has less than 25% of the time and the other parent has primary placement, who pays for variable expenses in that arrangement?
By default, the parent with primary placement would pay for variables.
So the primary placement parent has to pay all the variable expenses? Why is that?
They do, and it's primarily because how child support is calculated. A lot of people who come to talk to me know these percentages in Wisconsin. I've got one kid. If I've got to pay 17%, which is only true if the other parent has primary placement. So the parent with primary placement is getting likely the full amount of child support allowable under kind of Wisconsin law. And because they have that full child support payment and presumably more of the discretion over these types of expenses because they have the kid most of the time, I think that's why it's set up where that parent's responsible for these variable costs. Of course, we can negotiate something different, but by default, that's how it works.
Understood. That makes sense. So there could be an arrangement based on what you're describing, right? Where a parent with 50-50 placement is paying child support because just because you have equal shared placement doesn't necessarily mean you're not paying child support, because if you earn more money than the other parent, you in fact would be subject to child support. So you could be paying child support and still be sharing in variable expenses on a equal shared basis.
Yes. Yep,
Wow.
that would be the most common arrangement on a 50-50 schedule. Someone's going to be paying child support, both parties are going to be paying variables.
Got it. So it sounds like this could be a pretty broad range of what's covered. How can a parent be prepared for what they're going to be asked to chip in for?
Primarily, the best way to control and plan for that is to negotiate in good faith with your spouse, soon to be ex spouse, and figure out what we're agreeing to cover, what we classify as variable expenses. And oftentimes in our agreements, there's either a checklist attached to them or built into the agreement a very specific list. We agree that school expenses extracurricular activities, music lessons, summer camps, daycare, whatever it might be, are variable expenses, and we're going to split them 50-50. So have that list, have that discussion. Don't leave it open ended because that will cause issues later.
Yeah, the being prepared, get it done in advance, know what you're committing yourself to going into it, as opposed to in hindsight wishing, gosh, I really wish we had been more clear on who's supposed to pay for what.
Yeah.
What about these activities, right? I think you had said extracurricular activities or sporting events, right? Like those come with obligations, not just a price tag, but schlepping the kids around to soccer and dance and baseball. Who's responsible for getting the kids to these activities?
Yeah, and that's something that you absolutely should work out in a parenting plan. I encourage people to have language in there that you're not going to schedule activities on the other parent's time unless there's an agreement to do so beforehand. That keeps conflict low. Language in there that if an activity is agreed upon, the parent who has placement is going to make sure the kids get there, right? Barring some extraordinary circumstance. And sometimes it helps because these club sports that a lot of kids are in these days, thousands upon thousands of dollars. So have in there a limit or a threshold that you have to have an agreement if the expense is going to exceed that amount.
Oh, that's a great point of advice. So it's knowing who's you're committing not just to share a cost, but you're sharing a responsibility of if we sign the child up for this, we're both responsible for getting the child to the activities. And then knowing that there's a limit on who can just incur an expense. What happens? Let's say you pick, I don't know, what's a normal cap? What would you suggest is what you've seen in your agreements as a cap?
I would say most commonly, $200 seems to be the most common. I've seen some as low as 50, which I don't recommend because a lot of expenses these days are over 50, and it's
Yeah.
just going to cause a lot of unnecessary back and forth. But somewhere between $100 and $300. So $200 seems to be the sweet spot, but it's whatever best fits the two families and their financial resources.
And so what happens if you put the $200 cap in the agreement and mom signs the child up for Irish dance and it costs $800? Then what?
That's always a hard question because we want the children to be involved in these extracurriculars, right? Sometimes there's financial constraints. You receive that bill and you can't afford it. You can't afford it, right? There should have been a discussion and agreement beforehand, just as if you were an intact family trying to figure out what activities your kids are going to do. At that point, I usually encourage people if it's an activity that you think your child will enjoy and will benefit from, let's try to figure out if there's a payment plan, a payment arrangement to be made, and make sure that if the objection is legitimate, not just something you don't want to pay, but something that you can't pay probably.
Got it. How do reimbursements work? So inevitably in most cases one parent fronts the cost. How does the reimbursement work?
Yeah, usually we will want language in the parenting plan or the financial portion of the agreement to detail, all right, if a parent incurs a cost and it's under that whatever limit it is, they have 15, 30 days, whatever makes sense for their situation, to provide receipt to the other parent that they had paid it. And then that other parent has 15, 30 days to reimburse, depending on what they agreed to.
What do they have to submit? Just a request? I mean, do you have to give any sort of proof?
Yeah, usually some co-parents don't require it all the time, but best practice would be you're going to get a receipt or a statement or some kind of proof of payment. Send that along to the other parent.
And what if you don't do it in time? If your agreement says you need to exchange these every month and you forget or just kind of put it on the back burner and you send it 4 months later.
Yeah, the agreement should have what happens in those situations. That usually the language is those costs are deemed waived. In practical terms, I would encourage clients. I have some clients say, well, they sent it 45 days late. I'm going to tell them, pay it. It's for your kid. But technically, you don't have to, right?
Yeah.
That's why you worked out those terms.
Yep. Well, this is all very helpful. Any final bits of advice for our listeners out there who are going through this now or might be going through it in the future?
A couple more thoughts. One would be I've worked with so many people. We've got a 1-year-old, a 2-year-old, and they push back on, why are we talking about a vehicle purchase now? Why are we talking about car insurance now? Why are we talking about cell phones now? They're not applicable, but they will be. And you don't want to go back to court. Think long term, think about cost of college searches, AP test, club sports when they're older, vehicle purchases. Think about all of that and really have a clear plan in place so you don't have to come back to your attorney. You don't have to go back to court, at least for those reasons. And then finally, we mentioned this when we talked in an earlier podcast, a parenting app is a great tool to keep everything organized and central. Out-of-pocket medical costs, variable expenses, keep everything central, organized, and clear on who owes what.
Any suggested app that you see people use and has worked well for clients?
Yeah, we should try to get them to pay us for free advertising. But Our Family Wizard, Two Houses, Talking Parents, there's a bunch of them out there.
And so those apps have features where you can screenshot receipts and send information back and forth and kind of keep almost an accounting of what was exchanged, when it was exchanged, did the reimbursement happen?
Yeah. And they even have Our Family Wizard, at least, as a tool where you can set up to pay directly to and from the app, which is nice.
Yeah, that's very nice. This is great. So it sounds like takeaways: be detailed upfront, know what you want to include, be specific on reimbursement time frame and details, and think long term. So this is really, really helpful. Austin, thanks as always for being with us. Really appreciate it. It's always a pleasure.
Well, same here. Thanks, Holly.
You might think that variable expenses are straightforward, but even a small misunderstanding can lead to big issues. Find out how custody and visitation are actually decided in this next video.